Elena Cross moved through the quiet airstrip just before dawn, her boots leaving soft prints on the shimmering tarmac as the hum of the private jet echoed in the desert air. She was the last to board and the only one who did not seem to fit in. Among the polished shoes, tailored suits, and expensive watches that surrounded her, the others looked at her with faint amusement, whispering among themselves as she walked down the aisle and took a seat near the back, her duffel bag resting by her. Feet her jacket. Plain, her face calm and unreadable, she had the bearing of someone who had seen too much and spoken too little. Her eyes scanned everything without turning her head. The pilot gave her a nod. She returned it, then looked out the window. As the engines began to roar and the world outside started to fade away. The men seated across from her were loud, their laughter sharp and careless, the kind of laughter that came from arrogance rather than joy. They spoke of contracts and operations. In countries that never made the news, each story more exaggerated than the last, they bragged about firefights and payouts while sipping imported whiskey and tossing careless remarks about soldiers who never made it home. One of them, a broad-shouldered man with a smug grin, glanced her way and asked if she was a journalist or someone's assistant. She didn't answer at first. She simply adjusted her sleeve and said she was there for observation. Her tone was soft but firm like the edge of a blade. Hidden beneath silk, the man chuckled and muttered that civilians should stay out of warrior business. The jet lifted smoothly through the morning haze, and the silence of altitude filled the cabin for a moment, before another voice broke through. This one belonging to a heavy-set contractor with scars that told half-true stories. He asked if she was one of those peacekeeping consultants that had never seen real combat. His friends laughed loudly, clinking their glasses. Elena's gaze didn't waver. She told him quietly that experience doesn't always need to be announced. Sometimes it just stays in the bones. The room went quiet just long enough for the engines to be heard again. Then the laughter returned louder this time, covering their discomfort. One of them leaned in closer, squinting at her wrist where a thin, pale scar ran across the skin. He smirked. Asking if she got that while filing papers, she turned her hand slightly, looked him dead in the eye and said, "Training accident." Her voice, flat, calm, final. The men chuckled again, but their leader Voss, the one sitting nearest the cockpit, studied her longer. His expression shifting from mockery to curiosity. There was something about her, the way she moved, the way she didn't flinch under pressure. It was the silence that unnerved him, not the words. He watched her for several minutes, then leaned over and asked, "What kind of training gives a woman scars like that?" She replied without looking at him, the kind that teaches you not to ask twice. That made him pause just for a heartbeat before he smirked again, saying she had spirit. But that didn't mean much up here when the big boys were talking. He raised his glass and toasted to the real soldiers of fortune. The men cheered as if they were proving something. The flight attendant came through, offering refreshments, but Elena refused. Instead, she reached into her duffel and pulled out a notebook, flipping it open to blank pages and writing something slowly, methodically. One of the men snickered, asking if she was taking notes on their stories, but she didn't respond. She only wrote 3 words, then closed the book and slid it back under her seat. The silence that followed felt heavy like a storm before. Lightning Voss couldn't shake the feeling that something about her wasn't normal. He reached for his phone, typing her name into a private database, his brow furrowed as the results came back. Restricted clearance. He looked up again. The cabin. Lights flickered once and then steadied. Voss grinned, thinking he had her cornered. He leaned back and said, "Cross, huh? I once worked with a Lieutenant Cross, tough guy. Seal, maybe you're his sister." She didn't answer. The men laughed. One of them said, "Maybe she's just using the name to sound important." Voss kept pushing, saying maybe her brother died and she's trying to live in his shadow. Elena turned her head slowly until her eyes met his, and the laughter died. "Just like that," she said. "You talk too much," and went back to staring out the window. Her tone so quiet yet so sharp, it felt like a slap without motion. Minutes passed like that. the sound of the engines deepening as they reached cruising altitude, but inside the cabin something shifted. Voss poured himself another drink, trying to hide the unease creeping into his chest. He motioned toward her duffel bag, telling one of his men to check what she was carrying. They laughed like schoolboys at a dare. The man knelt down, unzipping it and spilling its contents across the aisle: tactical gloves, folded documents, a small metal case, and a worn navy patch. The laughter stopped instantly. Voss stared at the items and then back at her, asking what kind of civilian carries that she looked at the mess on the floor, then back at him and said, "Only someone you shouldn't test." The pilot's voice broke through the tension, announcing mild turbulence, but the real storm was already inside the cabin. Voss stood towering over her and said if she was playing games, she picked the wrong plane. Elena leaned back, eyes unblinking, and said, "I told you once, don't test what you don't understand." The words hung there, heavy and strange. Voss wanted to laugh, but he couldn't somehow. He felt like he'd just stepped too close to a wire he couldn't see. The jet shook lightly as it passed through a thin cloud. The lights dimmed for a second, and in that flicker of half-darkness, Elena's face didn't move. Not even slightly. Voss told his men to sit down, but they were already watching her like they'd seen something they couldn't name. She closed her eyes briefly, maybe counting, maybe remembering, then opened them again with the calm of someone who had no doubt about what came next. Outside, the sky stretched endless and pale, but inside the cabin the air grew tight like a string pulled too far. Voss muttered something about her being a fraud, yet his voice carried a hint of hesitation, the kind that comes when instincts whisper louder than pride. He took another drink, but his hand wasn't steady anymore. Elena didn't speak again. She only rested her hand lightly over her sleeve, where beneath the fabric something faint moved like a memory pressed into skin. No one noticed that the pilot's route had changed, or that the silence between them had turned from mockery to tension. But Elena noticed everything. Her gaze shifted to the reflection on the polished metal across the cabin, where she could see Voss watching her every move, and as the engines roared against the thin air above the desert, she knew this flight wasn't going to land the way they expected it to, and that thought stayed unspoken, but heavy, filling the space between heartbeats, as the world began to tilt toward something none of them were ready for. And in that moment, as the light outside began to change, as dawn broke across the endless horizon, the quiet soldier sitting among the arrogant few finally allowed a faint, almost invisible smile. The kind that comes before the storm. The kind that means someone just crossed a line they shouldn't have crossed, and the cabin suddenly felt too small for what was about to happen next. The morning light bled through the thin jet windows, washing the cabin in gold as the air grew heavier with tension and stale whiskey. Voss leaned back, pretending to laugh again, but the sound came out forced, brittle, like cracked glass. His men followed his lead, trying to shake off the chill that had settled after they saw what spilled from her duffel bag, yet no one could stop glancing toward Elena, who sat perfectly still, her back straight, her eyes distant, as if listening to something none of them could hear. The hum of the engines filled the silence like a warning, but they ignored it, thinking power still belonged to them, thinking she was just bluffing. The youngest contractor, a loud-mouthed man named Cooper, tried to break the silence. He said, "Maybe she's special, ops, or maybe she's just pretending to be." He reached down, picked up the navy patch from the floor, and tossed it toward her, saying, "Show us your war face, sweetheart." The laughter that followed was short, awkward, like they were trying to convince themselves the threat wasn't real. Elena looked at the patch lying by her boot, then slowly met his gaze without saying a word. It was that silence again, deep, unbroken, and sharp enough to cut through pride. Cooper's smirk faltered. He muttered something about her being creepy and turned away, but his hands shook slightly as he reached for his drink. Voss took the patch from the floor, rubbed the worn fabric between his fingers, and asked where she got it. Elena replied calmly from someone. Who earned it? Voss narrowed his eyes and said, "You talk like you've been there." She said, "Maybe I have. Maybe I never left the desert." The cabin went still again. The engines hummed steady, but inside, everything felt unstable. A storm brewing just beyond sight. Voss set the patch down and said, "Then prove it. Tell me what you know. Tell me who you served." Under her response came slow. Deliberate, she said, "I served under silence, and those who break it never last long." The tone in her voice wasn't anger. It was certainty, and that certainty made them all shift uncomfortably in their seats. The jet hit light turbulence, the kind that rattled glasses and loosened tempers. Voss cursed under his breath, saying the pilot better keep steady or they'd be in for a rough ride. He looked at Elena again and said, "If you want to act tough, you picked the wrong flight. We run security. We know real soldiers." She tilted her head slightly, eyes unblinking, and said, "Then you should know real soldiers don't talk about it. They just survive it." The words landed like stones, heavy and cold. She wasn't trying to argue. She was simply stating truth. And truth always hits hardest when arrogance has nowhere left to hide. Cooper whispered to the man beside him, saying, "Maybe she's some kind of undercover, cop or spy." The other shrugged, saying, "If she were, we'd already be in cuffs." The laughter that followed sounded hollow. Elena didn't move. She was listening to something outside. Maybe the rhythm of the engines, maybe the way the air shifted every few seconds like pressure rising. She noticed details. No one else cared for the uneven tone in Voss's voice, the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, the nervous movement of the man 2 seats ahead, adjusting his sleeve where a faint bulge hinted. At a concealed weapon, she saw all of it catalogued. It stored it away. Voss leaned forward again, his confidence forcing its way back through the cracks. He said, "Let's settle this show. Us your ID or get off this plane." Elena turned her head just slightly, enough for the light to catch her scar again, and said, "You don't want that." Voss laughed too loudly, saying, "You think you scare me? You think some ghost story is going to stop me?" His words spilled like smoke, and she just looked at him, saying softly, "Not yet, but you'll wish it did." His hand tightened on his drink, and for a heartbeat he felt the truth in her tone. But pride is a dangerous thing. It blinds faster than fear. The pilot announced they'd be stopping for refuel at a private strip outside El Paso. The man groaned, thinking about the delay, but Voss saw it as his moment. He muttered that he'd handle her once they landed. No stowaways, no pretenders on his flight. Elena caught the words. Though he didn't know it, she kept her eyes forward, expression unreadable. But inside she was ready, every detail of the aircraft memorized, every escape route, calculated her breathing. Slow, measured, steady, like someone trained to strike only when the time was right. As the jet began its descent, Voss stood and told her to pack up, saying the flight's over for her. Elena didn't move. She said quietly, "I haven't reached my destination yet." Voss sneered, saying, "You reach it when I say so." He gestured for Cooper and another man to stand beside him. They were big, loud, full of the confidence that comes from never being tested. They walked toward her, blocking the aisle. The engines lowered their roar, replaced by a deeper hum that seemed to echo through the cabin. The air felt thick, electric. Elena slowly stood, her shadow stretching across the narrow aisle. She was smaller than all 3 of them, yet somehow they stepped back half a foot before regaining their composure. Voss told the pilot to taxi to the far end of the strip where no one would see them. He turned to Elena and said, "You can walk from here. Maybe the sun will teach you some respect." The hatch hissed open and hot desert air filled the cabin. The men grabbed her duffel, ready to toss it out. She looked at the open door, then back at Voss, and said, "You should think carefully about what line you're crossing." He laughed, saying, "The only line here is the one you're walking across now." She took a step forward, but not out. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "You really should stop now." The engines roared louder, the smell of fuel and dust mixing as the plane began to roll. Voss shoved her shoulder and said, "Get out now, or I'll make you." She turned her head slightly. The faintest movement. A warning he ignored it, pushed again, harder. Her feet shifted closer to the edge of the hatch, wind whipping her hair across her face, and still, she didn't flinch. Voss said, "I don't care who you think you are. You don't belong here." And with that final word, he nodded to his men and they grabbed her arms, hauling her toward the edge. She didn't struggle, didn't fight. She just looked at Voss one last time, eyes steady, voice calm, and said, "You'll regret this before the day ends," and then she was gone, falling into the dust below as the jet's wheels lifted and the engines screamed into the bright, endless sky. Voss laughed too loudly, his men cheering, clapping each other on. But none of them could shake the look she'd given them, the words that still echoed in their heads. "You'll regret this before the day ends." He poured another drink, trying to bury the unease that crept like shadow under his skin. He told himself she was no one a liar, a fraud. Just another story to laugh about later. But outside on the runway where the wind tore across the earth, something was already shifting. The dust rising, the heat shimmering, and a figure standing still against the glare, waiting for them to realize that their mistake wasn't just arrogance. It was the start of their downfall. And the next time they saw her, it wouldn't be from a seat inside a jet. It would be from the ground, looking up, frozen by the truth they had mocked too long. The dust rose behind the private jet as it gathered. Speed across the runway, its engines thundering through the desert air. But Elena Cross was already on her feet, her body steady, her mind colder than the morning wind. The heat rippled around her as the jet lifted away the shadow of its wings, slicing. Across the tarmac, she stood there unmoving, watching it climb into the sky until it vanished beyond the ridge. She took one deep breath, then reached into her sleeve where a small signal device rested against her skin. She pressed once the red light, blinked, and the silent message was sent. Miles away in a command center deep beneath a nondescript facility, an encrypted alarm appeared on a black screen. The coordinates pinged near El Paso, a signature that hadn't been active in 2 years, and operator turned to his superior and said quietly, "Sir, it's her." The superior froze, then issued 3 words that moved an entire chain of response. "Locate, secure, confirm." Back on the ground, Elena brushed the dirt from her jacket and began walking. Toward the hangar on the far edge of the strip, her steps silent. Even on the gravel she had trained too long to ever make noise by accident. Her mind replayed every moment on that plane, every smirk, every insult, every careless laugh, and most importantly, every face she had seen. She knew exactly who each of them was. Voss, leader of the mercenary network, Black Ridge Defense. Cooper, the talker, but not the thinker, Delgado. The quiet one who carried the gun under his jacket, and the pilot who thought he was working for a security contract, but was actually part of something darker. She had seen enough to confirm the whispers she had been following for months. She reached the hangar door and tapped twice a coded rhythm. It opened slowly, revealing 2 figures in tactical black gear. Both saluting without a word, she stepped inside where the hum of machines filled the air rows of monitors, displayed live feeds of military installations, and one of them showed the same jet now airborne heading. Southwest, the operator turned saying, "We lost voice contact. But the signal tag is active. We can intercept if you give the order." Elena said, "Negative track only. They don't know yet, and they shouldn't. Not until we have proof." Her tone was steady, the command natural. She removed her jacket, revealing the faint outline of the trident tattoo that ran from her wrist to her forearm. The younger soldier's eyes widened slightly. Realizing who stood before him, he had heard stories about her, the silent operator, the one who disappeared after Operation Iron. Tied meanwhile inside the jet, Voss poured himself another drink, laughing too loudly. Saying, "See, boys, that's what happens when someone pretends to play soldier." His laughter echoed off. the cabin walls, but it didn't reach his eyes. Cooper sat across from him, tapping nervously on the table, saying maybe we went too far. Voss glared at him, saying, "Don't start." She was nothing. You saw how she acted, scared, stiff. But even as he spoke, his voice wavered. He turned toward the window, staring at the empty desert below. And for the first time, he felt a flicker of unease. Something about the way she looked at him before they threw her off, that calm certainty, that silence, it had weight. Delgado adjusted his sleeve, his fingers brushing against the hidden pistol strapped to his leg, saying, "Boss, maybe we should check who." She was her badge, said contractor. But the bag didn't match the story. Voss slammed his glass down, saying, "I don't care. Who she was, she's gone." The pilot's voice came over the intercom, saying, "We've got a reroute order, sir, heading further south to the drop zone." Voss frowned. Who sent it? Pilot said, "Came through secure channel." Same as always, he nodded, but deep down he knew something felt wrong. Back in the hangar, Elena watched the radar display tracking the jet as it veered off its usual route. She said softly, "They think they're still in control." The operator asked. Permission to intercept. Her eyes narrowed. "Not yet. They need to arrive before they understand." She turned away, picking up a headset connecting to a secure channel. Her voice steady as she said, "Cross to command verification. Echo 1 ready for phase 2. The voice on the other end answered. "Confirmed. Proceed with discretion." The wind outside picked up, carrying the scent of dust and metal. Elena walked out again, watching the horizon where a faint glint marked the fading trail of the jet. She knew Voss's type, arrogant, untested men who confused noise with power, who thought silence meant weakness. She had faced many like him before, and every one of them learned the same lesson. Pride is the last thing that dies. She walked toward a waiting vehicle, a black SUV without markings. The driver saluted, and she entered the back seat. The vehicle moved swiftly down a dirt road, kicking up clouds that disappeared behind them. Inside, the jet tension started to creep in as the temperature gauge flickered and a faint alert blinked on the control panel. The pilot frowned, tapping the screen, saying, "Minor system error." But Voss didn't hear him. He was too busy checking his phone. There were no signals, no messages, no network. He cursed, throwing it aside, saying, "What the hell is wrong?" With this thing, Cooper tried his phone. Same result. Dead silence. Delgado looked toward the cockpit, saying, "Maybe we lost comms." Voss nodded, but his jaw tightened. He looked out the window again, scanning the sky, and that was when he saw it. A shadow moving below them. Not another jet, not a bird. Something sleek, black, fast, following them from below the radar line. He leaned forward, shouting to the pilot, who said negative, no contact on scan, but Voss could see it now clearer with every second. It wasn't chasing them, it was tracking them. The pilot tried to change altitude, but the controls resisted like invisible hands holding the jet in place. Voss shouted again, demanding answers, but none came. Cooper's voice cracked as he said, "What if she wasn't bluffing?" Voss turned on, him snarling, "Don't start that again. She's not special. Ops, she's nothing. She's... He stopped mid-sentence as the cockpit lights dimmed, replaced by a single blinking red indicator that read, "Override engaged." The pilot stammered, "Sir, we're being remotely controlled." Voss grabbed the intercom, yelling, "Who the hell is doing this?" But the only response was static. Then a single tone, long and cold, followed by a woman's voice, calm, measured, familiar, saying, "You should have listened." Voss froze, his blood turning to ice. On the ground, Elena watched through the monitor as the jet adjusted course toward the secondary airfield. She said softly, "Phase 1. Complete initiate containment," and the operator beside her whispered, "Ma'am, do you want us to extract?" Her expression didn't change. "No extraction necessary?" "They'll come to us?" She turned her gaze back to the window where the sunlight was fading behind thick desert clouds. Her reflection sharp and steady, she thought. about the men on that jet, the arrogance, the cruelty, and how easily they mistook silence for surrender. She knew the moment they landed, the truth would break them. In the jet cabin, the men were panicking, shouting at the pilot, demanding control. But the aircraft ignored every command. The autopilot locked as the engines shifted. Pitch Voss's drink spilled across the table, and his confidence finally cracked his mind, replaying every warning, every glance, every quiet word she had spoken, each one now heavy with meaning. She had said, "Don't test what you don't understand." And now he understood too late. The jet descended toward the isolated airstrip, surrounded by empty land and dark vehicles, waiting like shadows, stretching across the sand. The engines screamed as they approached the runway, and as the wheels touched the ground, Voss realized they hadn't escaped her at all. They had been delivered straight into her hands, and whatever waited beyond that hatch was something none of them were prepared to face. The jet's wheels screeched against the rough runway as it landed hard, bouncing once before the pilot managed to steady it. The men inside grabbed the seats, their knuckles white and their voices sharp with fear. Desert stretched endless around them. No towers, no lights, no movement except a few dark shapes in the distance. Voss leaned toward the cockpit, shouting, "What the hell is this? Where did you bring us?" The pilot stammered, saying, "It's not me, sir. The controls, they're locked. We were guided here." Voss cursed, slamming his fist against the bulkhead as the engines wound down and a heavy silence filled the cabin. Outside, the sun had begun to dip toward the horizon, painting everything in red and gold. The heat shimmered off the tarmac as black SUVs rolled from the shadows toward the plane, their movements precise, coordinated military. Voss felt the air tighten around him, his throat dry. He turned to his men, saying, "Stay sharp. We don't know who they are." But his voice lacked the certainty it once had. Cooper muttered, "Maybe it's her. Maybe she called them Voss, snapped, 'Shut up, she's gone.' You saw her hit the ground." But even as he said it, his mind refused to believe it. He had seen soldiers before men, broken and bent. But that woman, the way she moved, the way she looked at him, there had been something too controlled, too deliberate. The pilot called out from the front, saying, "We're being hailed by ground control. They want us." "To power down and open the hatch," Voss barked. "Don't you dare!" But the pilot's hands were shaking. The screen in front of him flashed a single message in black text. "Open the door." Voss stared at it, the letters steady, the command, absolute, something about it chilled him because he knew that kind of certainty. He had seen it once before on classified missions, the kind where mistakes weren't allowed, the kind where death moved quietly and without warning. The hatch hissed open, a slow release of air and heat pouring in from the desert as the men raised their weapons, aiming into the sunlight. The silhouettes approached step by step, their boots crushing gravel, their formation tight, 3 in front and more behind. All armed, all silent. When they stopped 10 meters away, the one in front lifted a hand and they froze. She stepped forward, her jacket plain, her hair pulled back, and though the sun burned against the horizon, they could all see it. The faint glint of the trident inked. Along her forearm, Voss's gun dipped, his lips parted. No words coming out. Elena Cross walked toward them. Calm, steady, every step deliberate. The men lowered their weapons without realizing it, her presence heavier than the heat itself. She stopped. At the base of the hatch, her gaze sweeping the cabin like a blade, without lifting a weapon, without raising her voice. She said, "Step out one by one. No sudden moves." Voss stammered, "How the hell are you alive?" She looked at him, the faintest trace of a smile on her lips, and said, "I've survived worse." Cooper went first, his hands raised, shaking his eyes, darting between her and the armed soldiers behind her who stood like shadows without expression. The pilot followed, muttering apologies. No one heard. Delgado stepped out next, dropping his weapon at her feet. Elena said, "Neil, he did." before realizing he had obeyed without question. Voss stood in the doorway, his body tense, his pride warring with his fear. He spat at the ground, saying, "You don't scare me?" She looked up at him, eyes cold as stone, saying, "That's not my job," and then turned to the team behind her, saying, "Secure them." The soldiers moved instantly, snapping restraints around wrists, moving with silent efficiency. No one resisted, not even Voss. Though he glared at her with every breath he took, she stepped closer until they stood face to face, the fading sun burning behind her. She said, "You had something that didn't belong to you." Voss sneered, saying, "We move data all the time." "It's business?" she said. "No, it was betrayal." His face twisted. He said, "You have no idea what we do," she replied calmly. "I know exactly what you do. I've been watching for 6 months." The words hit harder than any weapon. His breath caught his mind, flashing back to every meeting, every coded message, every unmarked transfer he thought was secret, and realized none of it ever was. He said, "You were one of us. You can't just—" Elena interrupted her voice, quiet but final. "I was never one of You deal in chaos. I deal in control, and control always wins." He started to shout, but the soldiers beside him pushed him to his knees. She turned away, signaling to one of the vehicles. The back doors opened, revealing 2 agents in plain tactical gear, carrying sealed black cases, the kind used for evidence collection. One of them handed her a tablet. She glanced at it, scrolling through data, and then said, "Bring the pilot forward." The pilot stumbled to her side, trembling, saying, "I didn't know. Ma'am, they told me it was authorized." She looked at him for a long moment, then nodded, saying, "Then you're free to go, but don't fly for them again." His eyes widened with relief as he was guided away. Cooper began to cry quietly, whispering, "We didn't know. We thought you were just some clerk." Elena didn't look at him, she said softly. "You saw someone quiet and assumed she was weak. That's the mistake most men make. They see silence and think it's submission. It never is." Voss lifted his head, his voice rough, saying, "What do you want from me?" Elena crouched slightly until her eyes met his and said nothing. "You've already given me everything I needed, every word on that flight, every signal, every name. The jet was bugged before. You even boarded it." The look of horror on his face was almost enough to make her pity him. "Almost," he whispered. "Who are you really?" She straightened her posture, her expression unreadable, saying, "Lieutenant Commander Elena Cross, Naval Special Warfare, Counterintelligence Division." The words struck like thunder. Even the soldiers behind her stiffened. Slightly, Voss shook his head, whispering that division doesn't exist. She said, "No, it doesn't," and walked away, leaving him kneeling in the dust as the sun finally dropped below the horizon. The darkness came fast, the floodlights from the vehicles snapping on, casting harsh white light across the field. The soldiers moved with precision, cataloging everything, retrieving files, drives, hidden compartments. Inside the jet, every secret laid bare. Voss watched it all, powerless, as his empire crumbled piece by piece around him. The men he had commanded now, silent captives. The plane that once carried his pride, now a cage he couldn't escape. He shouted her name once, but she didn't turn. She was already walking toward the SUV, her shadow stretching long behind her across the tarmac. As she reached the door, one of her agents handed her a communication device saying, "Command wants confirmation on the asset status." She replied, "Secured and contained, awaiting transport." The agent nodded, stepping back. She paused for a moment, looking toward the horizon where the last of the sun had disappeared. The wind carried the faint scent of fuel and dust, the smell of endings. She took one last look at Voss kneeling in the dirt, surrounded by the wreckage of his own arrogance, then turned and entered the vehicle. The door closed, the engine started, and the convoy began to move away, their lights fading. Into the desert night, inside the car Elena leaned back, eyes closed, the mission complete.